Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today's episode is part 2 of a conversation with Jay Stringer about his book, Unwanted. Let's begin with a quote from the book. Jay writes, and it's so short and so important, "I am asking you to consider the possibility that your sexual struggle is not random." What if he's right? What if your sexual struggle is rooted in your story, particularly your story in your family of origin? That's where we're going today. Thanks so much for listening. Remember that if you want to listen to episodes as soon as they are released, you need to download the Place We Find Ourselves app, which you can do at the App Store or the Google Play Store. All episodes will be available for free 4 weeks after they are released to the app. So if you want to support the podcast and get immediate access, instructions are on my website. Thank you, and here's part 2 of my conversation with Jay Stringer. Yeah, where have you come from and where are you going is in many ways kind of the framework for your book. So it's organized around 3 simple questions. How did I get here? i.e., how did I get into all this unwanted sexual behavior? Why do I stay? And how do I get out of here? In the section on how did I get here, you begin to get more specific about the linkage between our unwanted sexual behavior and our story with our family of origin. And here's how you put it. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that your sexual struggle is not random. You go on. Jesus says that unless you leave your family, your mother, your father, you cannot follow him. We cannot walk with Jesus into healing if we remain loyal to protecting the people that most contributed to our harm. There's a difference between honoring our parents and remaining loyal to them. So this notion of loyalty is so important. What do you mean by remaining loyal to protecting the people that most contributed to our harm? How do we remain loyal to them? And what's the alternative that you're inviting us to?
Yeah. So, I'll give you an example from a client. So one of my clients would kind of just say, I grew up in a great Christian home. My dad went to most of my ball games. My mom, she could lose her temper every once in a while, but she was like, made all the meals, lunches, she did my laundry. And they end up just telling a really bland story about their life. But then they start talking about their own sexual struggles as adolescents, even before that. And it's like they're the most wretched human being that ever came to exist. And so with one of the guys, he was one of the things I normally ask people about is to kind of tell me about their first sexual experience or their first exposure to pornography. And he said, I've never really thought about that, but my first exposure came from a descrambler device in my basement. For those that, listeners that don't know, a descrambler device is basically some device that allows you to descramble erotic cable channels. So a lot of those things that are filtered out or that you have to get a subscription for, this box kind of unlocks all those so that you can see it. And he said, Jay, you know what? I wish I had just thrown that box away. But then I asked him, well, who do you think put that box there in the first place? And he said, I never thought about it, but totally my dad. And so I was like, this dad that went to your ball games, this dad that was really present was actually probably addicted to pornography. And you could kind of just begin to see his wheels turning, is that his dad left this kind of porn box in the basement for his kid to find. And then his mom knew that he was also watching it. So everybody in the whole family was complicit. And so that was kind of, if he just wants to protect his family, he's never going to kind of begin to see that both his mom and his dad set him up at about 10, 11 years old for a lifelong battle with pornography. And so most of us want to protect, I wanted to protect my mom and dad. I wanted to say that my dad was such a good minister, that my mom was such a good homemaker, that she loved us as kids, but I didn't really want to enter into the war that they set me up for.
Yes.
And so that's what happens a lot of times, is that we haven't really understood the role of our families in setting up the high likelihood that we're going to find pornography, that we're going to have a pretty significant struggle with sexual brokenness.
And so the invitation is really It's a question of loyalty to narratives. There is the narrative of my parents did the best they could. I came from a loving home. My sexual struggles are all on me. It's all my perversity and depravity. There's that narrative. And then there's a narrative which is frankly more robust, more honest, more nuanced. And it's invariably going to involve some measure of harm from our parents and some measure of sexual harm. Because as our mutual mentor, Dan Allender, says, every family is sexual. And that is something that needs to be confessed. There is sexuality in every family. And that sexuality, the nuances of it, the nature of it, the particularities of it, we have to find language for it if we're going to understand our current sexual struggles.
Yes. Yeah. And that's where I love Dan's notion that we have to hold honor and honesty together as kind of the same, two different sides of the same coin. And that when you look at, especially the scriptures, that's what they do so well. The reason that we know the stories of David and Abram, that he trafficked his wife a couple times and had sex with a concubine, is all because Scripture is a very honest document. But then they also honor Abram and Abraham as the founder of our faith, the one who left everything that he had in order to go into the land that God called him. And so that's really that ability to hold honor and honesty taught. And so I think that that's really what this invitation is that it's not an issue of blaming. It's not an issue of trying to indict your parents, but it is to say that we have to study the conditions that got us there. This is more from Patrick Carnes, but Patrick Carnes would say that a lot of people who struggle with unwanted sexual behavior, sexual addictions, tend to come from two different types of family systems. One is a very rigid family, and one is a very disengaged family. And so the rigid family is lots of rules, lots of regulations. You may have had a belt or just a lot of shaming looks if you did anything wrong. And then a disengaged family is far more, maybe you were a latchkey kid, your parents were gone quite a bit. When you think about going through middle school, just that sense of, did someone attune to you? When you came back from a really difficult day at school, you were made fun of, got a bad grade on a test. Did someone have the capacity and willingness to kind of say, there's something different about your face when you got off that bus today than when you left today? And so what happens for most of us is, if we grow up in a rigid family home, lots of rules, lots of power, lots of control, one of the reasons why sexual brokenness, pornography, promiscuity can kind of begin to appeal to us is that it gives us a sense to have our own power. We can regain a sense of our own autonomy of, you might have control and regulation over me when you're in the house, but as soon as you're gone, I have porn, I'm able to reestablish something. Part of what happens with rigidity is that it creates the high likelihood for anger to emerge. And so what happens with lust is that lust kind of plants the soil, disengagement plants the soil for lust to bloom, because you're always kind of scanning the world to say, is someone going to see me? Is someone going to love me? Is someone going to be there for me? And then that gets hijacked into a much more of a sexual lust realm. And so for most people that grow up in rigid families and disengaged families, their sexual brokenness kind of came out of that. And so that's what I'm inviting people to consider, is that if sexual brokenness has a lot to do with lust and a lot to do with anger, how do you begin to study the conditions where something of that battle formed?
I just want to shift gears a little bit, because you make a claim that I think is so provocative and frankly quite hopeful. And you're talking about why we go back to this stuff that we don't want to be doing. And you say people make bad decisions not because of the potential for pleasure, but to add additional evidence to their self-judgment. Here's what I'm hearing you say. Here's what you're saying. You're saying pornography use is not primarily, or unwanted sexual behavior is not primarily driven by a pursuit of pleasure. It's primarily driven by my desire to add evidence to my self-judgment, my self-contempt, my self-condemnation. Is that what you're saying?
Precisely. Yeah. And this is a big paradigm shift. So, I mean, a lot of times you hear self-medicating language, you hear some escape language pretty often when it comes to unwanted sexual behavior. But I think, like, I mean, this is just where, I mean, to be as blunt as I can, after you're done looking at porn, very few people are like, wow, that was just exceptional. Can't wait to do that again. You have some sense of, I've merged with something that I feel duped by. I feel, I mean, maybe a little bit soiled by it, but there's just that experience of, I don't feel great about what I did. And it's not something that I just can't wait to do again in the future. Maybe when you're, 13, 14 years old, you can have that experience. But after you've done it thousands of times, there's that experience of, I feel far more like crap than I did even an hour ago. And so I think that all unwanted behaviors, whether they're in the eating disorder realm, sexual brokenness realm, they all have that experience of, I don't feel good about what I've chosen. And so when I look back at some of the difficulties, especially in the realm of sexual brokenness that I've had, especially in college, would be this experience of, I lived with a roommate that worked the closing shift at Starbucks. And so he used to bring in like all these cookies, cake pops, blueberry scones, pumpkin scones, and kind of the most seductive of all to me, the apple fritter. And I can remember eating, apple fritters, drizzling white chocolate sauce on the top. And again, I don't pathologize any type of food. I think everything has a place. But after I've eaten a couple apple fritters with white chocolate sauce, I feel terrible. And it would be in that feeling of, I just hate myself. I hate who I am. That using pornography would at first be some place of escape from that feeling of terrible. But then, 10 minutes later, I'm feeling the shame of, I've just looked at porn and I've just consumed thousands of calories. And now, I'm a sexually broken fat man is basically the voice that I would hear. So I think we have to be really honest to say most of our sexual brokenness doesn't really help us to escape. It actually confirms the core judgments that we have about ourselves.
It confirms the core judgments that we have against our own hearts. And in that sense, the assaults of evil against us, the accusations against us, we are somehow joining in them, and we're actually submitting exhibits to the court to condemn us with our unwanted sexual behavior.
Love that imagery. Yeah, they are exhibits in the court of our own judgment.
And what you're saying is far more than a pursuit of pleasure. Our pornography is our unwanted sexual behavior is often, hey, let's put another exhibit before the judge to condemn us. The alternative is on page 60, where you say, a heart with an ounce of kindness for your life story will accomplish so much more for you than a mind filled to the brim with strategies to combat lust. I love this sentence. You're inviting the alternative to condemnation is kindness. I mean, we can start with that. But this is a prophetic sentence, because if it's true, it changes everything. The posture that most of us adopt when it comes to unwanted sexual behavior is try harder to stop doing bad stuff. Just try harder. And you're saying that a posture of kindness toward my story will actually produce more results than a posture of stop it. How have you come to believe that?
The verse that's very well known in this is, Romans 2:4. Do you not know that it is the kindness of God that leads to change? And I think practically what that has looked like for me is, even in the last couple of years of getting this book out, trying to speak in different places, I spent a lot of my childhood not saying very much. And so high introvert, lot of internal dialogue. And so, I can remember sometimes after preaching a sermon, after giving a podcast, I would just begin to wince so much at the things that I would say, that I wasn't clear, wasn't eloquent, all those sorts of things, and just really began to berate myself. And then, I berated myself for 10, 15 minutes, and then go to a bunch of cashews, and I've eaten a whole bag of cashews. And then I feel terrible about that. And then I go for a run, and then I feel weak, and then I go eat some more. And it's like my whole day was completely dysregulated because of really probably came down to about a minute of a talk that I gave. And I'm like, why do I hate myself? Why do I judge myself? Why do I have so much contempt? And one of the things I think it was my sister-in-law first told me about, she's kind of in the nursing profession, talked about kind of the vagus nerve, that if you find a way to breathe 6 times in 1 minute, you can actually trigger a lot of the rest and digest and your parasympathetic nervous system to come online. And that, I had to do the math. I remember thinking, okay, so, dysregulated eating for 15, 20 minutes, an hour of exercise, kind of very bulimic structure, then feeling weak. And then that's 3 hours, or I could spend 2 or 3 minutes breathing. And to tell you the truth, the next few times I still chose the former way. But I think that's one of the things that I'm learning far more is if I can begin to breathe and to not try and berate myself, then I can come much more regulated. And then I think that's the way that our bodies have been designed, is when we breathe with kindness, we will change. We will feel rested. We will feel calm. We will feel okay. And so I think that's really been a big shift for me, even in the last couple of years, is when I confront something about myself or my work that I have not been fond of, I have a choice in that moment to kind of just continue the exhibits, as you say, or I can begin to be really kind to that part of my life, my story, and hopefully that will begin to grow with kindness, that those things will mature. But far more, it just feels good to not berate myself for an entire day because of a perceived failure that half the people listening could have picked up on. So
yes. And so you're talking about anger at self, but one of the main points of the section on why do I stay in unwanted sexual behavior is about anger. And so let's stay with the theme of anger for a minute. Here's what you say. I believe male anger to be at the heart of much of the sexual brokenness and violation in our world. Want to find out why you're so compelled to pursue unwanted sexual behavior? Figure out what's made you so angry. What is the relationship between unwanted sexual behavior and anger? I mean, how did you come to realize that, for example, pornography use was more related to anger than the mere pursuit of pleasure?
I've read some studies that have said that somewhere in the range of 88% of pornography that's out there has scenes of what could be considered anger and violence against women. So I think, some of my initial start in all of this was working for what's called a John School in the city of Seattle. Basically, people that were arrested for soliciting sex would go through this. And one of the guys that I was working with said, Jay, do you know what porn is? I said, what? And he said, it's basically pictures of prostitution. And that was a really big paradigm shift for me. That was just a big shift to kind of begin to see that there is violence woven into it. This is part of the spectrum of degradation and violence against women. And so really needing to engage that. And then from a theological standpoint, just studying under Dan Allender, just his assessment, understanding of Matthew 5 is that so much of sin is these issues of lust and the issue of anger. And I think what's happened in Christian circles is that we give all of our airtime, all of our podcast time, all of our radio time to this issue of lust. And so when you think about kind of what that excuses in the male heart, that males are Johns, right? But who are the women? They're sluts, they're whores. When men sexually act out, what are we? We're just lonely. We're just trying to escape something. But if a woman acts out, we have derogatory language. And that's what I really had to grapple with in this book is these aren't just matters of lust. And so what I've begun to think about is this notion of unwanted sexual behavior like a very powerful river. So if you were to think about unwanted sexual behavior like the Mississippi River, in order to understand the Mississippi, you have to understand its tributaries. So there's like the Tennessee River, the Arkansas, and I think the primary tributary is the Missouri River. And so I think what we've done in Christianity is we've tried to plug the lust tributary, but we have had no language to name the Missouri River of anger. And then we wonder why this keeps showing up at a pastoral level, at anybody in a place of authority and power. That porn is not about self-medicating. It's not about escape. It's far more about the issue of power. And so when I think about a guy who, wants to have sex with his wife declines because she knows that the meaning of their intimacy is basically have sex with me, or I'm going to make you pay somehow emotionally the next day. And she says no. And then he says fine. And then an hour later, he can't sleep. And then he's down in the basement in his bathroom looking at porn. That's not about lust. That's not about rejection. That's far more, I'm going to make you pay. And so I think that that's what we have to do with our unwanted sexual behaviors, is not just study our lust, but also kind of say we have some eroticized anger within us. And part of the way that we get revenge, part of the way that we get payback against our bosses, against our spouses, against our friends, is unwanted sexual behavior. So you have a lot of guys, a lot of women that look at Instagram and they see that their friends were hanging out and they weren't invited. And then they're looking on their own hookup apps half hour later. And what are they doing? They're metabolizing that experience of, yes, rejection, but also of their own anger. And I need to have some realm, some place where I can have power. And things like pornography and hookup apps give us the exact experience that we're looking for.
And the anger, you're in no way condemning the anger. You're saying, look, name it, acknowledge that what's driving me to this particular pornographic episode is at some level my rage about something in my life. And that invariably is then linked to my story, particularly when we talk about these disengaged families, rigid families. I mean, the powerlessness that is so pervasive for many of us with histories of family of origin harm. There's going to be rage, and that rage has to be blessed at some level, but it also needs to be repented of. But more than anything, it needs to be understood in context, in the context of my story. And I'm not going to get freedom from my pornography use or my other unwanted sexual behavior until I welcome this anger again as a guest and begin to be curious, why am I so angry? And that does not have to become a moment of self-berating. It has to become a moment of naming, there may be real good reasons that you're angry, but what are you going to do with your anger?
Yeah, and that's the language of listen to your anger, study it. And so I think of anger as like a radar, right? And so if there's something that comes across our screen that isn't quite right, that radar is going to go off. And so that's far more the invitation to confront that anger, that, every couple is going to have sexual desire issues. These are just kind of baseline that they don't tell us that when we get married. Most of it is like, Christian or not, you get married and sex is just supposed to work. And it's like, hello, there are going to be desire issues. And so what if instead of just kind of get that anger of like, why isn't your sexual arousal the same as mine, leads to a lot of anger for men and women alike. But I think that's the thing that even as a couple is, how do we study this? How do we kind of get a sense of we're really angry and pissed off at each other because we don't have the same desire structures. What if we actually confronted that anger and had integrity, not just with our sexual life, but with our anger, to say, how do we come back to the thing that we really want, the thing that we really desire, and hold on to that and not compromise, but still learn how to be kind, how to be inquisitive. And I think that's where I see most marriages begin to change, is not through compromise, but also not through contempt. And I think that's probably another book down the line, but that middle passage needs to be made. As a marriage that's full of contempt goes nowhere, a marriage that's full of compromise just is, oh my gosh, so boring.
So the third and final section of your book is titled How Do I Get Out of Here? And here's what you say on page 141. It's about a paragraph, but I want to read it all. More than just explaining some of the deeper dynamics at play in unwanted sexual behavior, my intent was to radically disrupt your view of your own story. My promise is that freedom from unwanted sexual behavior is indeed possible. I have seen it happen, but never apart from men and women engaging the pain and beauty of their own stories. Why is story disruption likely to begin to lead to a better understanding of my unwanted sexual behavior? Why are you inviting the reader to engage their story at a deeper level? Why this emphasis on our stories?
What comes to mind is two clients. One client basically was fired from a nanny position because the family thought that she was trying to steal basically watches and jewelry from different drawers. But the reality is that she put this kid that she was nannying for down for a nap and then started scanning around their bedroom for just kind of sexual material, pornography, vibrators, all that kind of thing. And so she just kind of, as she condemned herself over and over again of like, I'm a female porn addict. Am I the only one on the planet? She didn't know that about a third of all pornography users are now women. So this sense of she held herself in contempt. But when we kind of went back to unpack where those things porn initially showed up in her family story, it came from a grandfather who had porn in a guest bedroom or in a guest bathroom and had ordered her to go down into that bathroom in order to kind of clean the windows. And there was a porn stash right next to the glass cleaner. And so for her to kind of synthesize, those are the two things that I need to grapple with, is that yes, I have streams of sexual brokenness, but far more, I need to go back to where all that stuff began. So that was one person that came to mind. The second person that came to mind was just someone who has dealt with a lot of promiscuity, just a lot of sexually acting out. And a lot of her story had to do with kind of sexual abuse from a cousin. And this cousin kind of really adeptly recognized that her family system was very rigid, offered her no life, no play. And so what he started showing up in her life with was basically the invitation to play Super Mario Brothers. And as they began to play Super Mario, they laughed, they played, they took turns. And for her, it was this first experience of someone wants to hang out with me, someone wants to be around me. And then the play went from Nintendo into just kind of more and more sexual risk. And what happened within her abuse is that she actually, as you know well, Adam, felt a lot of pleasure in the midst of this. But then when she kind of began to get a sense of, I'm feeling sexual pleasure, but it's also a shameful experience. I can't talk to anyone about this, and it's with my cousin. What does that mean about me? She began to feel a lot of shame about her arousal. And so what happened to her throughout, I would say, high school and certainly into her early 20s was just a lot of sexually remixing that cocktail of she would bond with someone at work, she would bond with a coworker, bond with someone at her church, and then would begin to kind of remix. I'm being pursued, I'm being engaged, but then I also feel like crap about what I've done because now this is a coworker, this is someone that I go to church with. And so that's the disruptive nature of story work, is that what you see primarily is your own sexual shame and failure. But once you begin to just kind of hit the pause to be able to say, where has this story, where did it first show up? How am I reenacting a version of this? That's the disruptive work, to kind of begin to say this, this wasn't random. And so for that woman to kind of say, I bless what my body experienced in pleasure. I don't condemn it. But now how do I protect this woman and give her a sense of what she really wants, because she doesn't want random hookups with people that are incestuously close. I want something greater. And so that was for her, of being able to bless that desire that was back there, but then also stand with defiance against the work of evil, against the work of abuse, against the work of promiscuity that really led her to sabotage the thing that she wanted most. And so that's where change and healing took place for her, was a good year of saying, I bless that I am a sexual being, that I feel pleasure, that I felt pleasure back then, and kind of just that sense of, I'm not going to put myself in a position where I'm going to hate myself and feel shame for it later.
So good. And so indicative or exemplary of how, and this is what you're appealing to in your book over and over, you have to engage your story if you want to understand the sexual behaviors that absolutely torment you in your adult life. I just want to make a plea to the listeners. You have tried so many things. They have been moderately to not at all successful. Why not consider looking at your story? We have seen engagement of story lead to sexual freedom, period.
Yeah.
And frankly, I think many of us would rather do anything than engage our family of origin stories of harm. But nonetheless, the invitation is, will you have the honesty and frankly the courage to, and the compassion to the younger you, to look at how your story may be reenacting, you may be reenacting your story in ways that you're, and frankly, it's hard to do this alone. You need other eyes. And it doesn't have to be a trained therapist, but it needs to be a trained person. It needs to be someone who has done this work in their own life enough to be able to walk alongside you and help you make the connections between your own stories of harm, which may seem so innocuous to you. I mean, even the examples you've given today, Jay, it seems innocuous that there was a descrambler on my TV downstairs, but you asked him a simple question and the neurons in his brain rewired immediately. And all of a sudden he's got, in some sense, a bigger problem on his hands, because now he has the fact that he was set up by his mother and father.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the choice that we all have to make, is that there's two types of pain on this journey. Like, one is that you just feel like crap all the time because you're just reenacting stories and you just look at yourself with so much contempt, so much judgment. You're kind of disgusted with yourself, or you go back into your story and then you still have to confront pain. And so we have pain in either experience, and you have to choose. I think part of what I would also invite people into is, just as like unwanted sexual behavior is not random, the journey out of it isn't either. And so that was a big decision with the book, but also the research instrument that I made, is how do we actually create resources for the church, for accountability partners, for small groups, for individuals and friends, to begin to actually take this journey and do it well. So I partnered with a film called the Heart of Man film, and we created something called the Heart of Man Journey. And so this is a 18 episode, 4 to 5 month curriculum that is going to give everybody a very deep dive into how your story is shaping your sexual brokenness. So it's 18 episodes. You get what's called an unwanted sexual behavior self-assessment. That's 160 questions based in my research. And that's going to give you compass headings into, this is your relationship with your mom, your dad. This is what you're dealing with your own depression, anxiety, lack of purpose in the present. And here's your sexual fantasy life. So from the outset of the course, you get all of the data right up front with you. And then we have questions, whole curriculum designed that are really designed to get you into your arousal template, the things that you are aroused by, to write down the stories about your family of origin, to confront some of those things about your present day life and self-care, meaningful relationships, healthy healthy relationships and community. So we wanted to leave no stone unturned to be able to say this journey to freedom isn't random. It's not just you tell your story once at 20,000 feet and you're done with it. This is going to take you into the dirt of your own life and ask you to do that with some other people as well. So certainly if you're part of a small group, an accountability partnership of some kind, or just wanting to even do a self-study to take a deeper dive into this, check out www.heartofmanjourney.com. It's also on my website at jay-stringer.com.
So heartofmanjourney.com, you can go to, you can get this course, which will take you through what Jay has taken, what you've taken a lot of your clients through. The process of looking at your story, connecting it to your unwanted sexual behavior, and putting language to what will the journey out of this look like.
Yes.
Fantastic that you've done that work. And just invite people to go to either j-stringer.com. You can get the course that way, or heartofmanjourney.com, and you can get the course. Jay, thank you.
Adam, it's been so fun to be with you. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
It's been a pleasure, and thank you for writing the book. Thanks so much for listening. Also, if you want to access new podcast episodes as soon as they are released, remember to download the Place We Find Ourselves app and support the podcast by paying $2.99 per month. Instructions are on my website. Have a great week.